If you exist in this culture, you likely have heard the term gluten, and you might be wondering, do I have a sensitivity to it? There is so much information out there around gluten, whether or not you should and shouldn't be eating it, and it can get really confusing over time. And for a lot of people, it can lead to patterns of disordered eating. So I'm going to be diving into what exactly is gluten, what is gluten sensitivity, and I want you to walk away from this video feeling like you have a better sense of whether or not you have a gluten sensitivity and whether or not it would be helpful to not eat as much gluten or to forget about it entirely and really try to work towards including more of it in your diet.
You definitely want to take a listen to this.
But before we dive into that, my name is Catherine Metzelar. I'm a registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, here to help you create peace with food and your body so that you can live a more abundant life where food and body doesn't take up so much headspace and doesn't steal life from you. So what exactly is gluten? Gluten is simply a protein that is found in wheat and some other grains, and it allows the wheat and other grains to have that elasticity and structure. Now, for some, gluten can cause some uncomfortable symptoms, specifically for people that have something called celiac disease, which is where they have an allergy to the gluten and their body reacts to the gluten for that reason. When people with celiac disease eat gluten, they will have digestive discomfort, they will have inflammation, and it can be quite dangerous for people with celiac disease to be having gluten. So in this case, the recommendation is to avoid gluten. But what about the people that have more mild symptoms when they eat gluten? And this may be you, such as headaches, digestional discomfort, bloating, irritability, maybe other things that you're experiencing that is leading you to wonder, could this be because of the gluten that I'm eating? With this information, then what do you do? Do you cut out gluten? How do you figure out whether or not that is the cause of what you are experiencing? So the first thing that I want you to consider is that your symptoms are real. No matter what is happening, no matter what could be going on, I don't want to invalidate your experience because you are experiencing what you're experiencing. Sometimes when we start talking about the nuances of things like gluten sensitivity, it can feel like I or other people are saying that you're not experiencing it. Your symptoms are real, no matter what is going on. And I want you to consider a couple of things so that you can get curious about what could be going on before you jump to eliminating gluten entirely. So the first thing is that random symptoms like the ones that I mentioned, headache, digestional discomfort, bloating, etc., can be really uncomfortable and for some people really frustrating. So your instinct to want to cut out foods, in this case gluten-containing foods, makes a lot of sense, especially because we exist in a culture that tells us that all we need to do is cut out certain foods and food groups, and that will lead to us feeling better. And I want to offer that oftentimes the first step in all of this is to get curious about your symptoms. And as you get curious about your symptoms, I want to remind you that there's no reason to jump to conclusions. Cutting out foods as a first line of treatment when you're having uncomfortable symptoms and things happening in your body is never a good idea. It doesn't give us a sense for what could be going on that may or may not be related to the gluten that you're eating. There are other things that cause the same symptoms or symptomology that a lot of people say is caused by gluten. Now, does this mean that you don't have a gluten sensitivity? Absolutely not. What I am saying though is that there could be other things that are going on that's contributing to some of the symptoms you're experiencing. For example, digestional discomfort, bloating, all of those things can be related to not eating frequently enough and not eating regularly enough and not eating enough generally. So that's something to get curious about. Stress most certainly plays a significant role in how we're feeling, things related to, again, headaches, digestion issues, All of that can be related to stress, it can be related to lack of sleep, it can be related to not eating enough and not eating enough regularly. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about getting curious, wondering about what could be going on that may not have anything necessarily to do with the gluten that you're eating. So the next thing that I want to talk about is something called the nocebo effect. And you've probably heard of the placebo effect, which is when you perceive that something is going to have a positive outcome for you, you take it and then you experience it. This is in the case of when they're doing research studies and they're looking at, for example, the treatment in comparison to, say, a sugar pill. And people perceive that they're gonna get a positive outcome from the sugar pill and then they experience that. Well, the same thing can happen when we perceive a negative consequence or outcome. In this case, it's very common for lots of people when they perceive that gluten is going to cause them harm, that they then end up experiencing digestional discomfort and all the symptomology that is associated with having a gluten sensitivity, or for some people having a gluten allergy in the case of celiac. This may be really hard to hear. This is something that I want to offer to you gently and kindly as best as possible, in that it can feel like the first time, and I know I most certainly experienced this, the first time you hear it, it kind of sounds like, oh, so I'm making up the symptoms. You're telling me that because I'm perceiving the potential negative impacts of gluten in this case, then therefore I'm experiencing them. And the answer is yes, and it's complex. Our brains and bodies are really smart and wise. And so there's a lot of really interesting research around perception of something and the impact that it can have on us, in this case, on our body. So this is definitely a both-and situation. I trust you, I trust your body, I trust that what is happening for you is very real, and we exist in a dieting culture that is constantly demonizing foods of all kinds, especially gluten. And it's almost impossible to not internalize those beliefs and start to believe gluten is bad, gluten is gonna cause me harm, when in reality, that may not be the case for you, and it's not the case for most people. So if you're wondering about this, and if this is the first time you've heard of the nocebo effect, here are some questions that you can ask yourself to get curious about whether or not you have beliefs about gluten that may be impacting the experience that you have with the foods themselves. The first question is, how do you feel about gluten-containing foods? When you think about them, do you feel anxious? Do you feel stressed? Do you feel worried? Do you wonder if you're causing harm to your body? Number two, in what circumstances do you eat gluten-containing foods? Is it only sometimes and on occasion? We know that when we're not regularly eating foods, or when we cut out an entire food group and then we end up eating it, we will experience digestional discomfort. So if you're not having consistent access and consistently eating gluten, this can also lead to some challenging things. Third question, and this one I want you to ask yourself really gently and curiously, which is it possible that you are eliminating gluten under the guise of sensitivity as a way to continue disordered eating? It's a lot easier to say I have a sensitivity to gluten than to say I'm struggling with my relationship with food, or I'm afraid of carbohydrates, because gluten is in a lot of different kinds of carbohydrates. So it's an easier way to communicate to yourself and to other people that those are not foods that you're eating. Fourth question is, when you're thinking about foods that contain gluten in them, does any fear come up? Are you afraid of weight gain? Are you afraid of bloating? Are you afraid of what those foods will do to you? And the fifth question is there any room for exploration? Are you finding yourself that you are on one end of the spectrum or the other? Either this is it and I know that this is right, or I have nothing going on. Can you explore anything in the middle? Can you explore introducing some of these gluten-containing foods? Can you be open to the idea that some of your symptomology and the things that you're experiencing might be caused by other things that you're experiencing and that are going on in your life? With all of this said, there are most certainly some people that experience relief and benefit from excluding gluten-containing foods in their diet. I am not here to say what works best for you. All I'm saying is that if you are struggling with your relationship with food and you have heard all kinds of things about gluten, it can often be helpful to really introduce some curiosity into your experience and into your relationship with food, especially when it comes to gluten, because so many people go forward, cut out gluten, and their symptoms aren't resolved. Maybe they experience a temporary relief of some of their symptoms, which can be the case, but then they likely will come back. Again, there are some people that have celiac disease, and if you have any questions about any of this, my recommendation is always to go see your doctor and to make an appointment with an allergist so that you can test to see if you do indeed have something like celiac disease. This is something that's very serious. But beyond that, if you have heard or have been told that you have a sensitivity to gluten, I want you to be really cautious in cutting out a whole food group. Again, while not all carbohydrates contain gluten in them, oftentimes when people cut out gluten, they're excluding most of the carbohydrates in their diet. And one word of caution, there is a common allergy test that many naturopathic doctors will give called the IgG test. They will say they're testing for allergies, and majority of people will get back these laundry lists of all kinds of foods that they should be excluding. And for a lot of people on that list, they will see gluten, they'll see dairy, they'll see a bunch of other things, and they go down this rabbit hole and path of trying to exclude and cut out all of these foods. Here's what's important. That test, that allergy test, that is not done by an allergist who specializes in testing allergies, this is something different, is looking at the foods that you've been exposed to. It is not an indication of foods that you are sensitive to or that you have an allergy to. I really want you to know that the IgG test is not an allergy test. It simply looks at exposure. So we don't want to be using that either to look at whether or not you might have a gluten sensitivity and or whether or not you should exclude gluten from your diet. I know in this culture it can feel really challenging to navigate all the messages that you get from diet culture. And so I hope from this video, you are walking away with some more nuance. I am not saying that you're not sensitive to gluten, and I am not saying that you're not sensitive to gluten. What I am saying is that gluten sensitivity, when folks experience it, can be an umbrella for other stuff that is going on that often has nothing to do with gluten itself. And it's a common experience that individuals that have eating disorders or disordered eating are engaging in disordered behaviors like cutting out gluten, when in fact there is nothing going on that would require them to cut out gluten and is leading to more disordered eating. So let me know in the comments, have you heard things about gluten? Do you feel confused by it? Have you cut it out in the past only to realize that it actually wasn't gluten, it was something else? I'd love to know. Click like, share this video, and I will see you back here next